if we're going to be looking at the full history of rail travel, we're going to have to go way back to the year 600 BC. The Diokos in Corinth, Greece is one of the earliest known rutways, which is a predecessor to the railways that we know of today. It's essentially a paved road with grooves worn into the path to guide the wheels of large wooden cars that would carry anything from goods to entire naval vessels. These early versions of the technique used slaves or animals to move the cars along the tracks. Many similar versions of this idea existed across ancient Greece, and others were found in Malta and other parts of the Roman Empire. These early rutways remained in use for around 600 years, and most of them fell into disuse after the empire collapsed. It wasn't until 1768 in Coalbrookdale, England that iron was used in the development of railways. Iron plates were secured to wooden rails in order to reduce friction, which also allowed for different gauges to be used. Up until this point, all of the developments in the rail industry were for private use, mostly for transporting goods. But in 1806, the Swansea and Mumbles Railway was opened, which was the first horse-drawn passenger railway. By this point, steam engines had been around for just under a century, albeit for pumping water rather than for rail transport, and in 1812, Matthew Murray built Salamanca, which was to be the first commercially successful steam locomotive. Just 20 years later, in the 1850s, Britain had laid a staggering 7,000 miles of track across the country. The construction of the first underground railway, the Metropolitan Railway in London, began in 1860 and was opened in 1863. This line is still running to this day, but you may better know it as the Metropolitan Line on the London Underground network. The American rail system grew massively between then and the 1890s, although the Civil War did slow down certain developments. By then, the first transcontinental railway had been built, spanning an enormous 1,912 miles from the existing rail networks in Iowa and Nebraska all the way to the Pacific coast of San Francisco. It wasn't long until electricity found its way into the railways, with the first fully electrified line being completed in northern Italy in 1902. The early 1900s saw the first introduction of diesel power and became commonplace after World War II, since the price of labour needed for the upkeep of steam locomotives increased massively and consequently made steam power travel financially impractical. During the war, internal combustion engine technology had dramatically advanced to a point where they were cheaper to run and even more powerful than steam locomotives, which caused many railway companies to switch to diesel. And as if the rail industry wasn't suffering enough already, the large-scale construction of motorways came shortly after the end of World War II, making rail an even more unpopular mode of transportation.
Tokaido, for one of Japan's paved 17th century highways, and Shinkansen, which somewhat unglamorously means new main line. More appealing is the name the locals gave the train. Dango Panna means dumpling nose. That train could hit 210 kilometers an hour. Before the bullet train, it was the Mistraler, the train which gave France the lead in the quest for speed. In 1955, France captured the world speed record with an electric train clocked at more than 330 kilometers an hour. The age of the fast train had dawned.
The French realized that from the 1930s onward that a lot of their railway infrastructure wasn't where they needed it, and it was too slow. For them to allow the railway to compete effectively with the highway and the airline mode, they needed to go a lot faster. So what the French did, and other countries have emulated this, is they purpose-built high-speed lines and just connect the dots.
You know, to be the fastest train in the world, that was originally the Chelmsford Flyer, which was a Great Western Railway train. And then the Silver Jubilee, which was the first streamlined train introduced by the LNER. And of course it culminated in the world speed record that Mallard set in 1938 of 126 miles an hour. And that's never been beaten to this day. It's pretty amazing.
In July 1939, almost within touching distance of World War, Italian Railways organized a special press trip. A 3-car electric unit powered a special train from Florence to Milan at an average speed of 164 kilometers an hour.
And with George Stephenson, who opened the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, the first public inner-city form of travel by locomotive was created, along with the first casualty on the day of its grand opening ceremony. Like the canals that preceded them, railways were at first laid in order to improve transportation in the areas that were desperately in need of it. but it too became another means of speculative investment. And yes, more excessive enthusiasm for this wondrous means of transport brought on a railway mania that reached its height by the mid-1840s and significantly increased the network of railways from 1840 to 1852. Many mania lines had some reason behind them, though again there were plenty of others who were built just to satisfy investors. By 1860, the network of railroad lines that we are seeing today was complete, although construction continued up to the beginning of the 20th century. By 1914, the greater part of Britain boasted a network of over 20,000 miles with a reach into rural Wales and the Scottish Highlands. So as we have seen, both canals and railroads helped the regional economic systems that developed them. They increased the range and amount of what could be moved. More efficient and direct routes meant less time underway, and the more that could be hauled meant more profit. It is a no-brainer. Productivity can be increased through the improvement of transportation, which both the canal and the railroads provided in abundance. They also helped improve communication between cities, providing a faster postal service along with it. There was a whole lot that canals and railroads did for the Industrial Revolution, and a whole lot we just didn't have time to cover.
Well, the industry took a turn for the better in 1964 when, in Japan of all places, the Shinkansen high-speed rail trains were introduced between Tokyo and Osaka, which put rail at the forefront of intercity travel. And in the 1970s, the introduction of containerization became a huge player in revitalizing the rail industry, as it was the most practical way of the inland transportation of shipping containers, allowing the freight side of rail to become more competitive and able to become part of the intermodal freight transport system.
The first Eurostar service commenced on November 14th, 1994. Now, up to 400 trains carry an average of 50,000 passengers through the tunnel every day.
I used to run the Eurostars when they first started running, and we worked out that the competition was with the airlines, and if you had a train journey of less than 3 hours, people would rather catch a train than go to an airport, fly for an hour, but have to check in an hour before and land 50 miles away from where the name of the airport really is.
The latest generation bullet train using maglev technology is set to reach 500 kilometers an hour. The first bullet train reduced travel time between Tokyo and Osaka from 7 to just 3 hours. The next will bring it down to just 67 minutes. Maglev, magnetic levitation, does away with rolling resistance altogether. It is already setting records in Shanghai, where the shuttle from the airport to the city reaches 431 kilometers an hour on its 30-kilometer journey. 30 kilometers in 8 minutes. But true fast trains need more bridges, tunnels and viaducts to eliminate sharp curves. Such features account for about a third of the Takeido Shinkansen track length.